On a humid Tuesday morning, the federal courthouse in downtown Miami buzzed with anticipation. Journalists jostled for position in the packed gallery, their laptops balanced precariously on their knees and notepads at the ready. The hearing had attracted national attention, not only for the high-profile corruption case on the docket, but also because Florida's former Attorney General Pam Bondi would be facing off against Judge Edward Chen, a man whose reputation for ruthlessness preceded him. Judge Chen swept into the courtroom at precisely 9 a.m., his black robes billowing behind him like storm clouds. At 58, he carried himself with the rigid posture of someone who believed his position made him untouchable. His wire-rimmed glasses perched on a hawkish nose, and his thin lips seemed permanently set in a disapproving line. "All rise!" called the bailiff, his voice echoing through the suddenly silent room. As the proceedings began, Pam Bondi, immaculate in a tailored navy suit, approached the podium. Before she could speak, Judge Chen's voice cut through the air like a scythe. "Ms. Bondi, I see you're representing the defense today. I must say, I'm surprised you've taken on such a complex case, given your record." His emphasis made the words sound like an insult. Bondi's expression remained neutral, her blonde hair framing a face that betrayed no emotion. "Good morning, Your Honor. Yes, I am lead counsel for the defense," she replied. Chen shuffled through papers on his bench, not bothering to look up. "Let's hope you've prepared more thoroughly than in your last appearance in my courtroom. We wouldn't want another embarrassing performance." A ripple of tension spread through the gallery. Everyone present knew of the last case where Chen had repeatedly interrupted Bondi's arguments and denied nearly every motion she filed. What they didn't know was that Bondi had spent the past 6 months preparing for this moment. "I assure you, Your Honor, I am fully prepared," she replied, her southern accent slightly more pronounced, a subtle tell to those who knew her well that she was keeping her temper carefully in check. For the next 40 minutes, Judge Chen maintained his hostile demeanor, questioning Bondi's every statement with thinly veiled contempt. He allowed the prosecution considerable latitude while restricting Bondi's responses. Each time she began to build momentum in her defense, he found a way to interrupt or dismiss her points. In the gallery, seasoned court reporters exchanged glances. Chen's behavior crossed the line from stern to decidedly unprofessional. Several jurors shifted uncomfortably in their seats, noticing the disparity in treatment. Throughout it all, Bondi maintained her composure. While lesser attorneys might have crumbled under Chen's relentless pressure, she responded to each barb with respectful but firm replies. Those closest to her could see her occasionally jotting notes on a yellow legal pad, not frantic scribbles of someone overwhelmed, but deliberate, measured documentation. As the morning session neared its conclusion, Judge Chen looked down at Bondi over the rims of his glasses. "We'll recess for lunch. Miss Bondi, I suggest you use the time to reconsider your strategy. At this rate, your client might want to explore a plea deal." Several members of the prosecution team smirked openly. Bondi simply gathered her materials with unhurried precision. "Thank you, Your Honor," she said, her voice carrying just enough volume to be heard clearly throughout the courtroom. "I look forward to continuing after the recess." As Chen rose to leave, he didn't notice Bondi's co-counsel slide a thick manila folder onto their table, stamped with federal markings that hadn't been there when the session began. Nor did he notice the tall, stern-faced woman who had slipped into the back row during the proceedings, her Department of Justice credentials hanging from a lanyard around her neck. The storm was gathering, but Judge Edward Chen, in his arrogance, couldn't see the clouds. When court reconvened, after lunch, the air in the room seemed heavier, charged with unspoken tension. Judge Chen returned to the bench with the same imperial bearing, but now there was something almost theatrical about his disdain. The gallery had grown during the break, word having spread about the morning's contentious proceedings. "Ms. Bondi," Chen began without preamble, I've reviewed some of your filings during the break. I must say, I'm struggling to follow your legal reasoning. Perhaps you could enlighten us with your unique interpretation of precedent. A few members of the prosecution chuckled openly. One whispered something to his colleague, who covered her mouth to stifle a laugh. Bondi stood, smoothing her jacket. I'd be happy to elaborate, Your Honor. The precedent established in Harrison v. Miller clearly supports our position that— Harrison v. Miller? Chen interrupted, his voice dripping with condescension. Really, Ms. Bondi, that case was effectively gutted by the 11th Circuit just last year. I would have expected a former state attorney general to keep up with current jurisprudence. In fact, Chen's assessment was incorrect. The case he was thinking of was Harris versus Millbrook, an entirely different matter. The mistake was glaring to any competent attorney in the room. Before Bondi could clarify, Chen continued his public dressing down. Perhaps in Florida, the standards for legal argument are more flexible, he said, prompting more barely concealed laughter. But in my courtroom, I expect counsel to come armed with more than charm and political connections. Several reporters typed furiously on their laptops, capturing every word of the judge's inappropriate commentary. In the jury box, the jurors' expressions ranged from uncomfortable to openly disapproving. Your Honor, Bondi replied evenly, if I may direct the court's attention to the supplementary brief we filed, page 17 outlines the distinction between Harrison versus Miller and the case you may be referring to. Chen waved his hand dismissively. Ms. Bondi, I've been on the bench for 22 years. I don't need a refresher on case law from someone whose legal career has been more about press conferences than precedent. This time, the mockery crossed a line so blatant that even some of the prosecution team looked uncomfortable. The Department of Justice observer in the back row was now taking notes with focused intensity. Throughout the brutal exchange, Bondi maintained a calm demeanor that contrasted sharply with Chen's increasingly unprofessional behavior. She methodically documented each inappropriate comment and procedural overreach. Her legal pad now contained a detailed chronology of judicial misconduct that would make any appellate court raise serious questions. Your Honor, she said after a particularly cutting remark, may I request that my objection to the court's characterization be noted in the record? Note whatever you wish, Ms. Bondi, Chen replied. It won't change the weakness of your case. Chen looked around the courtroom, clearly playing to the audience. In my experience, when attorneys start objecting to the court's tone, it usually means they've run out of substantive arguments. More smirks and sidelong glances followed, but now there was something else in the room. A shifting current of sympathy toward Bondi and growing discomfort with Chen's behavior. During a brief sidebar discussion with both counsels, Chen leaned in close to Bondi, his voice low but still audible to those nearby. You're out of your depth here, counselor. Always have been. Your reputation won't save you in my courtroom. As they returned to their positions, Bondi's co-counsel slid another document across the table to her. She glanced at it briefly, then tucked it into her folio with a slight nod. The small gesture went unnoticed by Chen, who was too absorbed in his performance to see that the dynamic in the courtroom was subtly shifting. The court reporter's fingers flew across her stenotype machine, capturing not just the words, but the tone of a judge who had crossed the line from strict to abusive. In the gallery, a court sketch artist captured the scene that would soon appear on every news broadcast in the country. Judge Edward Chen, his face twisted in smug derision, looming over Pam Bondi, whose composed expression revealed nothing of the counterattack she was about to launch. 3 hours into the afternoon session, Judge Chen's mockery had taken on an almost routine quality. Each time Bondi attempted to present her defense, he found a new way to undermine her. The pattern had become so predictable that a palpable weariness settled over the courtroom, until Bondi finally rose to formally present her defense's opening. Arguments. Your Honor, before I continue with our defense, I'd like to address several procedural matters that have emerged during today's proceedings, she began, her voice taking on a new clarity and strength. Chen sighed theatrically. Ms. Bondi, we've already wasted enough time on procedural complaints, unless there's something substantive. There is, Your Honor, she interrupted, something she had not done until this moment. The small act of defiance created a ripple of surprise through the courtroom. I would like to direct the court's attention to Judicial Canon 2A, which states that a judge shall respect and comply with the law and shall act at all times in a manner that promotes public confidence in the integrity and impartiality of the judiciary. Chen's expression darkened. Are you suggesting that this court has failed to uphold judicial standards, Counselor? I am not merely suggesting it, Your Honor. I am formally entering into the record-documented evidence of judicial misconduct. The prosecution team exchanged alarmed glances. This was clearly news to them as well. Bondi approached the evidence cart and removed a thick binder. Your Honor deliberately suppressed exculpatory evidence in 3 previous cases, resulting in wrongful convictions that financially benefited Gulfstream Industries and their affiliates. She gestured to her co-counsel, who activated a laptop connected to the courtroom's display system. Email exchanges between Chen and various parties appeared on screen, their contents clearly showing judicial misconduct of the highest order. These communications were obtained through legal federal warrants as part of an ongoing corruption investigation, Bondi explained, addressing not just the court, but the reporters frantically taking notes in the gallery. The jurors, who had been watching with increasing disbelief, now stared openly at Judge Chen. One older woman in the jury box slowly shook her head, her expression a mixture of disgust and disappointment. Chen finally found his voice, though it had lost all its previous authority. This is outrageous. These allegations are completely documented, verified, and corroborated by multiple sources, Bondi finished for him. She nodded to Agent Rivera, who produced a sealed envelope and handed it to the court clerk. This contains a formal request from the Department of Justice for an emergency suspension of these proceedings pending a full investigation into judicial misconduct. As the clerk delivered the envelope to Chen, the judge's hands visibly trembled. The courtroom, packed to capacity, held its collective breath as the carefully constructed facade of judicial propriety crumbled before their eyes. Judge Chen fumbled with the Department of Justice envelope, his fingers clumsy as he tore it open. The courtroom remained in a state of suspended animation. No one moved. Few even seemed to breathe as the judge scanned the document. His face, previously ashen, now flushed with a mottled crimson that crept up from his collar. This is procedurally irregular, he stammered, reaching for the gavel as if its familiar weight might anchor him. These allegations should have been filed through proper channels, not sprung in open court as some sort of publicity stunt. Pam Bondi remained standing, her posture relaxed but alert. Your Honor, we attempted to address these concerns through proper channels 3 times over the past 4 months. Each filing mysteriously disappeared from the record. After the 3rd attempt, we were left with no choice but to present our evidence in open court, where it could be properly documented. She gestured toward the court reporter, whose fingers continued their relentless documentation of every word. For the record, copies of our previous filings, along with delivery confirmations, are included in Evidence Package B. The lead prosecutor, a veteran litigator named James Moretti, rose to his feet. Your Honor, in light of these serious allegations, the prosecution requests a recess to confer with the Department of Justice representatives present in the courtroom. Chen's eyes darted to the back of the room, where the number of federal agents had now grown to 5. They made no move toward him, but their presence was an unspoken threat, the machinery of justice turning its attention from the case at hand to the judge himself. Bondi's voice remained measured, but there was an unmistakable steel beneath her words. She motioned to her co-counsel, who approached the bench with a thick binder. This contains a chronological account of today's proceedings, annotated with the relevant judicial canons that we believe have been violated. A hush fell over the courtroom. Even the most seasoned reporters straightened in their seats. Additionally, Bondi continued, I'd like to draw attention to certain inconsistencies in Your Honor's handling of this case compared to similar matters before this court. She began methodically outlining disparities in Chen's rulings, citing cases where he had allowed the very same arguments she was presenting when they came from other attorneys. With each example, she provided case numbers, dates, and specific rulings, demonstrating a pattern that went beyond mere strictness into the territory of clear bias. The color gradually drained from Chen's face as he realized Bondi had been documenting his behavior, not just today, but over months of preparation. Her research team had compiled a damning record of inconsistent rulings that suggested his hostility toward Bondi was personal rather than procedural. Ms. Bondi, Chen said, attempting to regain control, this court will not entertain unfounded accusations against... These accusations are not unfounded, Your Honor, she replied, sliding another document toward the clerk. This is a formal motion for your recusal from this case, based on demonstrated bias. Under 28 U.S.C. Section 455, a judge must disqualify himself in any proceeding where his impartiality might reasonably be questioned. The Department of Justice observer had moved closer now, standing at the back of the courtroom with an unobstructed view of the proceedings. Furthermore, Bondi continued, her rhythm unbroken, we have reason to believe that Your Honor's impartiality in this specific case has been compromised by factors beyond the courtroom. She nodded to her associate, who distributed sealed envelopes to the court clerk, the prosecution, and the judicial assistant. These documents contain information regarding communications between Your Honor and parties with direct interests in the outcome of this case, communications that were not disclosed as required by law. For the first time that day, Judge Chen seemed genuinely rattled. He reached for his water glass, but his hand was not quite steady. This is highly irregular, Ms. Bondi, he said, his voice missing its earlier authority. Indeed it is, Your Honor, she agreed. Almost. As irregular as a federal judge meeting privately with witnesses scheduled to testify for the prosecution. A collective gasp rippled through the courtroom. The prosecutor stood, his face a mask of confusion. Your Honor, we have no knowledge of any such meetings. The court reporter's fingers froze above her machine for a brief moment before resuming their work with renewed intensity. The quiet tapping of her keys was now the loudest sound in a courtroom holding its collective breath. Chen's eyes darted toward the exit, then back to Bondi, who stood calmly waiting for his response. The power dynamic that had defined the day had shifted completely, and everyone in the room could feel it. This court will take a 15-minute recess, Chen announced abruptly, his voice strained. Ms. Bondi, I expect full documentation of these serious allegations when we reconvene. When Judge Chen returned from the recess, the transformation was visible. His earlier swagger had vanished, replaced by a tight-lipped formality that fooled no one. The gallery had swelled even further during the break, as word spread through the courthouse that something unprecedented was unfolding in courtroom 4B. Ms. Bondi, you may present your evidence regarding these allegations, Chen said, his voice carefully controlled. Bondi approached the bench, accompanied by her co-counsel, who wheeled a small cart bearing 3 large evidence boxes. Thank you, Your Honor. With the court's permission, I'd like to call as a witness Special Agent Marcus Rivera of the FBI's Public Corruption Unit. A murmur swept through the courtroom as a man in a crisp, dark suit rose from the back row and made his way to the witness stand. After being sworn in, Agent Rivera identified himself for the record. "Agent Rivera," Bondi began, "could you please inform the court about investigation 23J-C789, particularly as it relates to these proceedings?" Rivera nodded, his expression grave. "For the past 11 months, the FBI has been investigating a pattern of judicial corruption within this district. As part of that investigation, we obtained warranted surveillance of communications between Judge Edward Chen and several individuals with financial interests in cases before his court." "And what specifically did this surveillance reveal regarding the current case?" Bondi asked. Rivera removed a document from his portfolio. "We have documented 7 separate meetings between Judge Chen and Maxwell Harrington, the CEO of Gulfstream Industries, the primary beneficiary should the defendant, in this case, be convicted." Chen's face grew paler with each word. "All evidence presented today has been authenticated by the FBI Forensic Laboratory," Rivera continued. "The financial transactions have been verified through subpoenaed bank records from 3 countries. The recorded conversations have been confirmed by voice analysis to feature Judge Chen and the other named parties." Chen's legal training finally kicked in, a survival instinct overpowering his shock. "This court will take a 30-minute recess. All evidence will remain in the custody of the court clerk." As he rose to retreat to his chambers, Bondi spoke again. "Your Honor, given the nature of the evidence, we respectfully request that federal marshals secure the evidence during the recess to ensure its integrity." The implication was clear. She didn't trust Chen not to attempt to destroy or alter the evidence against him. The assembled reporters scribbled frantically, capturing every nuance of the unfolding drama. Chen froze, then nodded stiffly. "So, ordered." As he disappeared through the door to his chambers, the courtroom erupted into a buzz of whispered conversations. Bondi's legal team huddled together, their expressions serious, but with an undercurrent of carefully restrained triumph. The prosecution team had moved to a corner, engaged in an intense discussion with 2 of the Department of Justice representatives. In the jury box, several jurors were openly discussing what they'd witnessed, all pretense of neutrality temporarily forgotten in the face of such extraordinary developments. One elderly juror caught Bondi's eye and gave her a slight nod of approval. Inside his chambers, Chen paced frantically, occasionally glancing at the phone as if debating whether to make a call. His judicial assistant knocked tentatively. "Judge, Chen, there are 2 FBI agents here who wish to speak with you." Chen's shoulders sagged. "Send them in." Meanwhile, in the courtroom corridor, reporters huddled around their phones, breaking the story that was already sending shockwaves. Through the legal community, courthouse security had established a perimeter, keeping at bay the growing crowd of curious onlookers and additional media who had rushed to the scene upon hearing the initial reports. Bondi stood apart from the chaos, phone in hand, listening intently to someone on the other end. Her expression revealed nothing, but those who knew her well would have recognized the slight softening around her eyes that indicated satisfaction at a long-planned strategy unfolding precisely as intended. When the 30-minute recess stretched to 45 minutes with no sign of Judge Chen returning, a subtle shift occurred in the courtroom. The federal agents who had been positioned at the back now moved to strategic points near the exits and the door to the judge's chambers. The court clerk, who had returned from a whispered conversation with someone in the hallway, looked visibly shaken. At precisely 52 minutes after the recess was called, the bailiff emerged from the judge's chambers. Instead of the usual announcement calling the court to order, he approached the Department of Justice representatives and engaged in a brief, intense conversation. One of the agents nodded and pulled out his phone, stepping into the hallway to make a call. Pam Bondi observed these movements with the calculated awareness of someone who had choreographed much of what was unfolding. When her co-counsel leaned over to whisper something, she gave the slightest shake of her head, a signal to wait. 5 minutes later, the doors at the back of the courtroom swung open. A woman in a tailored charcoal suit entered, flanked by 2 U.S. Marshals. She strode purposefully to the front of the courtroom, her credentials identifying her as Deputy Director Lauren Vasquez of the Department of Justice's Public Integrity Section. "Ladies and gentlemen," she announced, her voice cutting through the murmurs that had filled the room, "I am here to inform you that Judge Edward Chen is currently being detained pending formal charges of judicial corruption, obstruction of justice, bribery, and racketeering under the RICO Act." The courtroom erupted in shocked exclamations. Several reporters bolted for the doors, racing to be the first to break the expanded story. Furthermore, Vasquez continued when the noise had subsided. "By order of the Chief Judge of the 11th Circuit Court of Appeals, these proceedings are hereby suspended. The defendant's case will be reassigned to a different judge, and a full review of all cases presided over by Judge Chen in the past 5 years will be conducted." She turned to address the jury directly. "You are all dismissed with the thanks of the court. You may be recalled when this case resumes under new judicial supervision." As the jurors filed out, many casting glances of grudging respect toward Bondi, Vasquez approached the defense table. "Miss Bondi, I understand your team has additional evidence relevant to our investigation." Bondi nodded. "Yes, Director. We've compiled documentation on 17 cases showing a pattern of judicial misconduct. My office will provide complete cooperation with your investigation." The lead prosecutor, Moretti, joined them, his expression grave. "Director Vasquez, I want to state for the record that the prosecution had no knowledge of Judge Chen's activities. We'll be conducting our own internal review to ensure the integrity of our cases." "I understand, Mr. Moretti," Vasquez replied. "For now, I suggest both legal teams prepare for a complete restart of these proceedings once a new judge is assigned." A commotion at the door to the judge's chambers drew everyone's attention. 2 U.S. Marshals emerged, Judge Chen between them. The transformation was shocking. The imperious figure who had dominated the courtroom hours earlier now looked diminished, almost frail. His hands were secured in front of him with stainless steel handcuffs that gleamed under the fluorescent lights. Chen's eyes, vacant with shock, briefly met Bondi's as he was led toward the side exit reserved for prisoner transfers. In that moment of silent communication, understanding dawned in his expression. The realization that his downfall had been orchestrated not through luck or circumstance, but through the patient, methodical work of the woman he had so arrogantly dismissed. Bondi's face remained professional, betraying no emotion as the disgraced judge was led away. Only those closest to her might have noticed the slight squaring of her shoulders, not in triumph, but in vindication of the justice system she had served throughout her career. As Chen disappeared through the door, a court officer approached. Bondi, with a document requiring her signature, a formal acknowledgement of the case's suspension. As she signed, camera flashes erupted from the gallery, capturing the moment that would dominate legal discussions and news cycles for months to come. The courthouse, which had witnessed countless dramas of human justice and failure, had rarely seen such a complete reversal of fortune in a single day. As Bondi gathered her materials, preparing to face the media storm that awaited outside, the weight of what she had accomplished settled around her. Not just a victory in court, but the exposure of corruption that had poisoned the system she had sworn to uphold. The scene outside the courthouse steps transformed into a media circus. News vans lined the street, their satellite dishes extended toward the sky like mechanical flowers seeking sunlight. Reporters jostled for position, microphones extended, camera operators angling for the best shot of what everyone knew would be the day's defining image. They didn't have to wait long. 20 minutes after the proceedings were suspended, the side door of the courthouse opened. 2 U.S. Marshals emerged, flanking Judge Edward Chen. In the harsh Florida sunlight, the handcuffs binding his wrists caught the light, sending prism-like reflections dancing across the white stone steps. Chen's face was a study in disbelief, the expression of a man whose world had imploded in the space of a few hours. His normally immaculate appearance had crumbled. His tie hung askew, and a thin sheen of sweat glistened on his forehead despite the courthouse's air conditioning. The marshals guided him firmly toward the waiting black SUV, navigating through the shouted questions and the blinding flashes of cameras. "Judge Chen, do you have any response to the corruption charges? Were you working alone, or are other judges involved? Did you target Pam Bondi specifically? Was it personal?" Chen kept his head down, offering no response to the barrage of questions. The man who had begun the day by publicly humiliating an attorney now couldn't muster the courage to face the public scrutiny he had brought upon himself. As the marshals helped Chen into the vehicle, the door closed with a finality that echoed across the courthouse steps.